Hello again, you lovely people. The Steed is back. I hope you're well. Christy and the Steed return. Steed and Christy on the opening bell. Thanks to Darren last week for holding court, for holding the fort, for steering the ship. Hope you enjoyed all of that. And we can now take a deep dive into what it was that transpired, of course, at Wembley and much more besides, with the ladies taking centre stage this weekend. We've also got one of the most violent heavyweight coronations in history to talk about as well. That's coming up on This Week a bit later on. Matt, Christy, how are you?
I'm a bit unnerved because I can see you looking directly into the camera. So
I did.
Yeah.
Do you know why? Considering I've been broadcasting for 2 or 3 decades, I noticed on the feed last week that because I'm a bit closer to my kind of office position, I'm a bit closer to the laptop than perhaps that you might see on other shows, or I would normally be. So last week when we recorded, I was looking right at you, which is kind of into the middle of the screen, but actually the camera's a bit higher. So I was trying to deliberately engage you lovely people briefly, but then I'll look back. I don't want to unnerve the Christy.
Where were you last week, pal?
You know where I was.
I didn't know. Did you go back to Ibiza?
Yes.
Oh, I didn't know. I thought that had been and gone.
No.
I thought your previous trip was when you went for all the closing parties and what have you.
No. We went to Ibiza in late July, early August, just for 3 nights, 4 days. But I mean, it's pretty intense. You're going clubbing all night. It's quite hard. So those don't really feel like holidays. So we went back for a week with a couple of friends, and yeah, went last Monday, went clubbing Tuesday and Wednesday, and then had the rest of the week off. So it was lovely. It was actually quite relaxing. I read 4.5 books.
Wow.
I was as happy as a lord. It was terrific. And the weather was okay. It wasn't as good as it's been in Ibiza, but it rained half a day, rained a couple of times overnight. But otherwise, it was cloudy and sunny, but it was nice. It was lovely. I was by the pool reading books about drugs in sport. It was great. Shall I tell you the books that I read?
Go on in.
Okay, so I read a book called Speed Trap, which is a book by Charlie Francis, who was Ben Johnson's coach back in the 80s. So it's a book that came out pretty much in the year 2 years after. I think he wrote it in 1990. So it's called Speed Trap. I think you can still buy it hardback on Amazon. Well worth a read. If you've got any interest in that period in time. I mentioned the Richard Moore book, didn't I, before, Matt? Dirtiest Race in History, which is worth a read as well, surrounding all of that as well. But you get it from the horse's mouth with Charlie Francis about what it is that he and Ben Johnson and some of those other athletes were doing and why they did it, essentially, on the back of systematic state doping from the East Germans and Russias through the 70s and 80s. So it's got all of that background and story, links, I suppose, pushing forward to why it is easy to dope and not to get caught. Etc., and the benefits of it. So fantastic book. I read one on Lance Armstrong called The Secret Race by Tyler Hamilton, someone who was in Lance Armstrong's team during the Tour de France before he left to dope on his own elsewhere with someone else. So that's really fascinating, getting an eye-opening account of what it was like to be in that particular team during that doping era. And my goodness me, the lengths they were going to get their blood bags and their EPO, and my goodness me. Yeah, so that was interesting. I read another Richard Moore book. What an author he was, the late Richard Moore, fellow Edinburgh Scot. He can write. You'd love it, Matt. The detail, the background info, all of that to bring those characters to life. But I read a book about the 1986 Tour de France, one of the most famous in cycling history, when Greg LeMond was a teammate of Bernard Hinault. And they kind of had a pact, having worked together the year before, where Le Monde could have attacked Hinault at a time when Hinault was weak, it seemed, in the 85 Tour de France. But being a teammate, that cycling code, etc., he helped Hinault win his record-equaling fifth Tour de France, and on the premise that the roles would be reversed in 86. And it didn't quite work out like that. So that's a fascinating story as well. Slaying the Badger, it's called. Another beauty by Richard Moore. So if you want to extend your reading list and take a further interest in doping in sport, that might well help you understand some of the things that may or may not be going on in the world of boxing right now, then I would suggest you add those to your reading list.
Wow. So when you're reading and you're on holiday with another couple and you're on holiday with your wife, I'm very impressed that you managed to find the time to read that many books in that amount of time, knowing what a social animal you are as well.
Yeah, well, I'm reading on the plane on the way out, the plane on the way back, and then, 5-6 hours by the pool all day, every day before. We're not going out. We're like the Spaniards when we're over there. We're not going out till 12:30,
right.
1 in the morning.
Oh,
so,
gosh, it's too late.
Yeah.
It's too late.
That's the way to do it. You basically go out, have to, usually around 1. Tuesdays is camel fat day at Pasha. Camel fat aren't coming on till about 2 anyway. So get there at 1. Maybe have a drink, maybe not. These days, I am a clean clubber. So none of that stuff for the steed these days. I'm a clean athlete. And then you have a few drinks beforehand, hopefully get the balance right, and then just coast through from 1 till 6. And Camel Fat Tuesday was just a brilliant night, great crowd, terrific atmosphere, maybe a slightly older crowd, whether that's them or it's Pasha these days, I'm not quite sure, but they're a marriage made in heaven. And yeah, My mate John, who was with us, he's several times he's turning to me on the dance floor. He says, "Do you know that person?" I'm like, "No." "Do you know that person?" "No." "Did you know them?" "No." "What about them?" "No." you make new best friends on the dance floor, don't you? And one of our new best friends, as he was leaving a bit later on, he came up to my wife Hannah with a big smile and an embrace, and he just shook his head and he said, "You got your hands full with that fella, haven't you?" So great time. How did you enjoy the boxing?
Yeah, it's one of those events, wasn't it? I think it's a shame in a way, because there was an awful lot that went on the undercard that a lot of those fights ordinarily would have been main events in their own right. But I don't doubt that we'll probably spend the vast majority of this podcast talking about the obvious one, the main event. It's one actually that has stayed with me ever since. It feels like it's a real big moment in British boxing history. I don't know if it's because when I was starting out, Joshua had when I started working in boxing, Joshua hadn't even put a pair of boxing gloves on. So we've been privy to the entire journey, the fanfare when he was an amateur, the Olympic gold medal, then this invincible aura that he had in those early days as a professional when he was knocking everybody out. When he would come into the press conferences with his chest out, but always very polite, fist bump all of us mere mortals as he came through. And to see him in that kind of state, where logic would dictate that he is very close to the end of his career, was not a shock, because that old cliche, it's heavyweight boxing, anything can happen. But it's quite sobering, I suppose would be the word, to see Joshua, who has been the king of British boxing for the last 7 or 8 years or more. Even if he hasn't necessarily been achieving between the ropes, he has still been, without question, the biggest star in the sport. But to see that star crumble so dramatically, so conclusively, so emphatically, so quickly, it was a curious sensation, to be perfectly honest with you. What about you?
Shock and awe were the words that kind of sprung to mind for me. Shock and awe. In terms of the feeling watching it and the kind of compression afterwards, shock and awe. And also the tactics of Daniel Debois, really, or the approach of Daniel Debois, perhaps shock and awe. Those were the words that really sprung to mind. You can never say shocked by the result, really, because there's always that in the air, isn't there, with the heavyweights? There's always in play. There's always the prospect that those cards are, if not on the table, then at least ready to be delivered. But yeah, shock and awe was kind of how I felt about it, both watching and in the aftermath. However, there was also shock and surprise at the way that Anthony Joshua boxed. I think the defensive naivety I found startling, really. And I know, and I'll probably read out some messages that were on my timeline on Twitter, because you could just simply say that the moment Daniel Dubois landed that first jab right hand, which was right on 30 seconds into the fight, you could, if you're in the Dubois business, you could, if you're a neutral, you could, if you're simply just a fan with that point of view, say that's the moment when the fight was decided. And that was 30 seconds into the contest. It's quite possible that's the case. My overriding sentiment is you have to be positive about Daniel Debois and what it is that he brought to the table and who it is that he's become as a fighter and a person. Comfortable in his own skin, full of self-belief, finding a confidence that seemed impossible, unfathomable a couple of years ago. And yet he has arrived at that place one way or another, and probably just because he has been road tested and battle tested again and again and again over the course of the last 2-3 years. But even allowing for all of that, and we're going to go into that, I was startled at how defensively lax and naive Joshua was right from the very start. And that bred a reticence where he was pawing with a jab, bat with a jab, but already on the back foot. Maybe it was all Dubois, and the reason for that, I'm not quite sure, Matt. I can't get my head around how defensively lapsed Joshua was right from the very start.
I was messaging someone on the Sunday, could have been the Monday, I think it was the Sunday, and there's always this sense, and I try and say this with the greatest respect for Joshua, because an awful lot of what he's achieved has been glorious and a privilege to witness, but he seems boxing illiterate at times, and it's incredible after all these years. He's still almost desperate to get to the stall, because you just look at the look of desperation when he's talking to a trainer, that he needs instructions, he needs to know exactly what to do. And I just think just the very small matter of what on earth was he doing with his left hand so low when he got 2 or 3 warning shots. But even before that, you should know. One would think you would know. And I'm far from the most boxing literate person. I think I know the characters quite well. I like to think about the mindset of the fighters, but I can't read a fight like Barry Jones can read a fight, for example. But there are certain things that you just grasp really early on and you understand and you can see that are wrong. And it was stunning. Like you say, in the first 30 seconds, it was, what on earth is Anthony Joshua, who's won numerous belts, who's fought at the very highest level, doing, fighting like this against someone like Daniel Debois, who even if you beforehand you were going to say Daniel Dubois had very little chance, I think every single person that was picking Joshua big would at least accept that Dubois had one chance, and that was the age-old puncher's chance. So you have to be wary of that. And it didn't seem that Joshua was wary of it at any moment in the fight. It just, from, like you say, from that almost that first exchange, it seemed like a matter of time before Daniel Debois was going to win that fight. And early on then, I was thinking, crikey, this could be over in the first round. And it very nearly was. It's shocking, like you say, yeah. Okay, the result, the fact that Joshua got knocked out is not shocking. But the manner in which he approached that fight, I wouldn't say it's shocking because we've seen it so many times before. And you go back and you look at what went wrong in all of his moments of uncertainty. He was overconfident when he got clocked by Dillian Whyte. He was thinking he was any moment now going to land the shot that took out Dillian Whyte. Pure carelessness allowed Dillian Whyte back into that fight. You could even say the same against Vladimir Klitschko, where he thought he'd got Klitschko out of there in the fifth round. By the end of the fifth round, Joshua can barely hold his gloves up because he's so exhausted. Again, you could argue that was a mistake. That was whether it was overconfidence. And I sometimes don't think it's overconfidence with Joshua. I think he's just desperate to get out of the fight. I think he's desperate to win the fight. But again, you go through his career, Andy Ruiz, he just dropped Andy Ruiz and then he got whacked more or less as he went in for the finish. There were moments in other fights, Kubrat Pulev caught him, that I remember, when perhaps you could argue he should have been a bit more gung-ho. He was all wrong in the first Alexander Usyk fight. So you just wonder if it's just something that he can't quite grasp, some of the basics that he can't quite grasp, and he's not going to now.
Every now and then with Joshua, Matt, you get a reminder of how fast-tracked the journey was around 2015, 2016, don't you? And it comes back in waves every now and then that you're reminded, he shouldn't have been here. He should have been developed and learning at a different pace along a different track. But because the landscape opened up, because Klitschko had been beaten by Fury was out of the picture, suddenly Charles Martin was a champion. And, I remember that so vividly around that time, 2015, 2016, where Eddie and those around Joshua were talking about, after the Dillian Whyte fight, that British level, making the right moves. Those were all of the watchwords and the conversations that were being had. But suddenly everything changed. When Fury beat Klitschko and Fury was gone, suddenly everything changed. You get a guy like Charles Martin, who's heavyweight champion of the world, for goodness sake. Sometimes you have to push the button. You have to say yes. You have to take your chance. And no one's blaming, criticising anyone in the Joshua business for making that move and pushing play at that particular moment in his career. But it did mean that the test came perhaps earlier than they should have done. And sometimes you get, since then, infrequently enough, you've had reminders that perhaps the right lessons weren't learned along the way, had things been allowed to develop in a different way. And you do get these reminders from time to time with his career.
I think you can go back even further than that. I think you can go back and look at him when he started out as an amateur. Now, ordinarily, when boxers will win Olympic golds, they'll have at least one Olympic cycle. So that's a period of 4 years behind them before they go in and then they win Olympic gold. But he hadn't. He'd probably had about 2.5 years prior to the Olympics where he was fighting at a certain level. And it was almost like that landscape opened up to him. This guy can win the gold medal. And if you look at another fighter from this era, you could say the same with Deontay Wilder. You watch Deontay Wilder fight sometimes, what are you doing? And again, he perhaps didn't have an ideal length of time to ground his skills and his technique as an amateur. And I do wonder if that is the case, because it has almost been like 100 miles an hour with Joshua from the moment he started. Because he was, as Eddie Hearn, I felt a bit for Eddie Hearn in the post-fight interviews, where you could see Eddie Hearn with his kind of just almost mourning the loss of his boy wonder. And he's talking about, I remember when he first came into the office. I remember when I first spoke to him, and this is someone we thought we could do something really big. And why wouldn't you if you're in Eddie Hearn's position? As you've just said, you can't blame them for taking those chances. You've got Charles Martin here holding an IBF heavyweight title in what is developing into one of the most promising eras that we've had for a while. We'll take that. We'll grab that low-hanging fruit, thank you very much, because that's not going to be around for long. But I remember saying at the time, I remember writing at the time, the only danger with Charles Martin is not Charles Martin, it's what comes afterwards. Because what are you going to do? Beat Charles Martin up, say you've won the IBF title, then vacate it and go back and go into 10-rounders. You can't. Once you've made that jump, you're not going to be able to get back to where you were. And Vladimir Klitschko was all of a sudden being mentioned as an opponent. And then he'd only beaten Martin, Brazil, and then they're talking about Vladimir Klitschko, and you're thinking, goodness me. Now they got Eric Molina in the interim, and then they got Klitschko. But I've said it so many times on this podcast, elsewhere, that fight with Klitschko changed him. And I was writing something for my weekly column for Boxing Scene at the moment, in that Joshua will now look at Daniel Debois and recognise and be envious of a 27-year-old man. 27 is a wonderful age once you get past it. You're like, wow, wish I was 27 again. But the thing is with Dubois, and I'm keen to give Dubois as much credit as we possibly can, is that he is so vacant in an enviable way, in that it's almost like he doesn't think about anything that's going on in the outside world. In a way that Joshua always had to think about what tracksuit top he was wearing, what cap he was wearing, who he was allowed to talk to, what he was allowed to say in certain interviews. But he must be looking at this young man thinking, that's the way to do it. Because Joshua never could do it quite like that. There's a lot of thought going on in Joshua's mind. And even though he's put a brave face on it now, Joshua, saying, well, you roll the dice, and he's coming out with all the cliches that he comes out with, that depression that will hit him is in the post. The humiliation of what he's just encountered is in the post. Because in this day and age, you can't avoid it. Now, I think what he remembers might be mercifully little of the fight, to be honest. I think he was concussed by the end of it. I think he was well concussed. He was out of it. But in this day and age, no sooner is Joshua desperately clawing at the canvas, trying to get up, can't understand why he can't get his legs to work properly. You've got memes all over social media. You've got people faux laughing, the laughing emoji. Ha, 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 ha. Yeah, hilarious. But he can't avoid that. And not only that, I think he could write off the Andy Ruiz loss because he knew that he'd suffered from that illness. He knew he was off during fight week. And okay, it was this little dude that looked like he'd never done a day of exercise in his whole life that had just chinned him. But he knew that all it would take was just to get right for the rematch and he would win. He knew what he had to do. With Alexander Usyk, in time, I would say he's got over those because Alexander Usyk remains a puzzle that nobody has solved. He can say to himself, well, I've just lost to an all-time great. And I wasn't that far off in the rematch, actually. So, okay, I can learn from that. I can build from that. But now he's just been knocked out, dropped, 5 times? By Daniel Debois, the guy that was in his shadows, the guy that he never thought would emerge from his shadows, the guy that he has always felt was inferior to him. And he's just lost to this bloke who now has just got... It's just like this mad robot, isn't he, Dubois? Just program him beforehand. Knock him out, knock him out. Okay, I will knock him out. And he just goes out and he doesn't even think about anything else. Doesn't think about if his left hand was a bit too low. He just goes for it. And that is Dubois' biggest gift. Might not serve him well in other walks of life, but in that boxing ring, right now, it is serving him so well. And I think those early defeats he had is really all he needed. Just to, reprogram a bit. Right, got it. This is what I'm going to do. Now, I'm not saying he's invincible. He's not. Fighters like that are not invincible. They look the most invincible when they're in full flow, but ultimately he will be beaten. He'll be found out. But for Joshua now, thinking, okay, yeah, well, I'll have the rematch. Once he's had time to digest it, is that really what he wants? Does he want to get back in the ring with that guy who isn't going to feel any pressure whatsoever? Joshua knows that he feels pressure now because he's been through it so many times, and he can't quite shake it off at certain times. Not downplaying Joshua's achievements, what he has done for the sport in this country, what he's done for the heavyweight division, is not to be sniffed at. I think history will be kind to Anthony Joshua. But he must be looking at Dubois now thinking, goodness me, that kid is something else.
Well, last week, one of the lines that I quite liked that you and Darren were discussing is the idea that, coming into it in the preview pod, that both Dubois and AJ are in a period of rebirth in their careers. And I think the line you said is, the problem is, one of them's in that period of rebirth at the age of 27, the other one is 34. And that's a big, big factor, really, when you're discussing all of that and when you were discussing it last week as well. The one problem about the Joshua playing catch-up on the job sort of discussion and argument, and I think it's a fair one, you do get recurring images of that throughout the latter stages of his career. There's no question about that. But in between all of that, you've had a very effective top level, one of the best around heavyweights, who's beating some really good, solid names. The thing that's really striking, despite all of those discussions, is I don't think we've ever seen as defensively naive a Joshua as we saw on Saturday night, with both hands down almost by his waist. I mean, his left hand was down by his waist. What on earth was he doing? I know against Usyk there was an element of that because he was more fluid and there was more movement and he was trying to match Usyk in a boxing contest. So I kind of understand that, but there was only elements of that. There wasn't as startling as striking a defensive setup or a non-defensive setup as there was against a guy whose big weapons essentially are jab and right hand, and that's what he did. But you're right to praise Dubois. What he has become, Matt, is quite incredible. And Kieran Gibbons, the Welsh journalist and commentator, messaged me on Twitter, and he said the jab knocked AJ out of his rhythm right from the off, and once hurt in the first, AJ never recovered. Don't forget, it took AJ 2 or 3 rounds to recover from Klitschko, and Klitschko let him off the hook, which he absolutely did. Kieran might have it. That it might be as simple as that. I think the truth is somewhere in between. I think that Joshua's defence was so poor, and Dubois was able to capitalise on that and capitalise on it early. And maybe Joshua never recovered thereafter. It's just, Matt, having made those early mistakes, you compound it at the end of the round, just when you're trying to work your way back in, and he gets caught with a right hand from so far away from distance. A kind of setup that a fighter of his standings simply shouldn't be succumbing to. And that was at the end of the round. So it was mistake after mistake, compounded, aided and abetted by a guy who has found himself. And that is remarkable, because let's be absolutely honest about it. Dubois is a guy who's been hurt and dropped by a cruiserweight, bridgerweight fighter in Kevin Lerena. Dubois arguably pulled himself out against Usyk, if you want to be deeply critical. He had life and death with Jarrell Miller, who is bang average. Tough, big, but bang average. And he had life and death with him. He found a way to win, and that may well be the turning point in his career. That hard, grueling fight where he managed to overcome adversity and find a way to win. That's probably the story of what we saw on Saturday night, born in that moment against Jarrell Miller, probably. But then you had it cemented by coming through repeated right hands against Ergovic and again finding a way to win. Suddenly, Dubois has become mentally strong. Dubois has become a fighter with self-belief. Dubois has found a guy who knows how to win, believes he can find a way to win. What a recipe this has become. And an unlikely one. An almost incredible, extraordinary, seemingly impossible one if you go back over the course of the last 2, 3, 4 years. Remarkable what you can do, Matt, with a bit of confidence and self-belief, and then the experience to back it up.
Yeah, I mean, I think I said to Darren something last week that if he'd told me, I don't know, 2 years ago or even 18 months ago, that Daniel Debois would even be in the position to be having a showdown at Wembley Stadium with Anthony Joshua, let alone walking through him, I'd think that Darren had been on the beer for days and days and days. I think it was absolute nonsense. What are you on about? It is incredible, the turnaround. And it's not just that he lost to Usyk and lost to Joe Joyce. It was the manner of those defeats. I don't judge him for not getting up when he felt the amount of pain he must be feeling against Joe Joyce. I think that computer programming mind that I speak of, the fact that he's just seek and destroy, I think it was given 2 minutes where it was malfunctioning, where Usyk is on the canvas from that, was it a low blow, was it not a low blow? And Dubois then is whirring round, what am I supposed to do now, what am I supposed to do now? And by the time Usyk got up, it was Usyk who was in the ascendancy. But these kind of turnarounds are not common. Not when you see capitulations like that. It's not common for a fighter to come back and scale the heights that Dubois is currently scaling. Just while we're talking about the constant use of the right hand, did you hear the commentary or the co-commentary from Shane McGuigan just as they were going into the 5th round? They'd listened to what Ben Davison had said. Now, I know there's a bit of a rivalry between Shane McGuigan and Ben Davison. I think it goes awfully deep for reasons we don't need to go into here. But Shane McGuigan said he's giving him the wrong advice. He just needs to have his hands up, and he needs to get through 2 rounds. If he goes out and does what he does again, he's going to walk into another right hand. And then that's exactly what happened. I mean, okay, it's not Nostradamus stuff, given what we'd already witnessed. But I thought it was interesting that Shane McGuigan was saying, why on earth are they not just telling him to put his hands up at this point? Because you can't say he was back in the fight, Joshua, going into the 5th, but he probably had his best period of the fight just before he got knocked out. But Shane McGuigan essentially was saying, now's not the time for that. Dubois still dangerous, you're still dazed, you need to get yourself through 2 rounds before you start thinking about going on the attack. Keep your hands up and just stay out of trouble. But that didn't appear to be the advice from the corner.
Interesting thing though, Matt, between rounds 4 and 5, Joshua was really alert in that minute in between rounds. He was talking, in conversation, communicating. There was a real dialogue and a sparky one between him and Ben Davidson about what it was happening, what it is that he needed to do, what it is that they might be able to do, regardless of what you think about the advice or the information or the content of that dialogue. I thought it was fascinating that he was so alert in that minute's rest in between the 4th and 5th rounds. Of course, he attempted to get on the front foot. He did catch. I don't think he hurt Dubois, but he stung him with a right hand. And because Dubois lost his footing, unbalanced, maybe he was hurt. Certainly Joshua thought he was hurt. But interestingly, Dubois, having been clipped with another 2 right hands, one of them he rode, the third one rode particularly well. So if he was hurt, he wasn't hurt in anywhere near as much as he was by that first slightly staggering right hand that Joshua caught him with. And Joshua went after him. But Dubois was so focused and alert. He tried to throw one of his own right hands, missed. But he knew where he was, and he was aware of the situation, so much so that he was able to beat Joshua to the punch with that much shorter right hand, almost threw it sort of crab-like. We've talked about that shot, haven't we, before in this week? His body was in an unusual position as he tried to beat Joshua to the punch. If you're going with a short right hand and someone else is trying to throw an uppercut, there's a significant distance between how far those punches have got to travel, and it's no surprise that it was Dubois who got there first.
What did you make of the performance of the referee?
I mean, I think he probably should have been counted out straight away. But
there was that moment, wasn't there? Was it round 3 where Joshua clearly had gone, his gloves hit the canvas?
Yeah.
And he should have been counted at that point. It was a curious. I thought I thought Marcus McDonough, he's not going to look back on that as a good night at the office.
It felt like there was a lot going on, wasn't there? I mean, arguably he could have had a word with Dubois at the end of when some of those left hooks were raining in at the end of the fourth?
Yes, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, there was a slip and then one punch that was counted and then one that wasn't. There was a low blow then. He had a lot to deal with. So it was a bit like a firefight, wasn't it? So I can understand. I'm not really paying too much attention to that personally. I think there was a lot going on. It was a machine gun contest where there was a lot to deal with. I think he missed a few things, corrected some that probably shouldn't have been corrected. Yeah, there were mistakes, but I don't think they were mistakes that necessarily had a huge bearing on the overall path of the fight itself. Interesting. I was just watching the kind of people's body language throughout this fight, and Dubois, no wild celebrations, Matt. Everyone else around him going mental. No wild celebrations from Dubois. And he was almost, I was watching him, the way he was looking towards AJ in his corner. I sense it was twofold. I think there was an element of concern and genuine kind of British boxing, heavyweight brotherly bond. I think there was probably a bit of that. I think there was an element also of him wanting Joshua to acknowledge him in some way, whether it's for congratulations, respect, or whether it was just some kind of contact so they both knew that they were all okay, having engaged in what they'd engaged in. I don't know, but just watching Dubois, because he was hanging around, he kept walking around, pacing around. He went to see Joshua once, but otherwise he kept looking back. And I thought that was fascinating. And so was Fury's face at the end of it, which told you every story that you needed to know. You could see... You'd see £50 notes, someone just ripping them up in front of his face repeatedly, couldn't you? Fury's face at the end of that.
There was something on social media. I mean, how these people get it all out there so quickly, I just don't know. But yeah, there was something on social media where... because Fury actually, when he was then interviewed by the various YouTubers and what have you, he was obviously very respectful. He was like, look, I've lost. Joshua's lost. It can happen to anybody in heavyweight boxing. But yeah, immediately as Joshua is being counted out, Fury says, you silly CUNT, you've just cost me 150 million quid. Because as long as Joshua had won that, then you could see them making Fury, whether Fury lost or won on December the 21st. It still would have been huge. But you never know, do you, if we'll still get that fight. I must say, for the first time in 6 years, I'm not even thinking about that fight anymore. And I remember writing it after the first Usyk-Joshua fight, that should have been the lesson. Because that's when it was huge. That's when it would have done big business. And we made the same mistake with Joshua Wilder. And there's all these fights that we may not go in to see. But I was reading something from Eric Raskin, who I just think is one of the best writers out there. I've always loved Eric's writing. He writes something for boxing scene, which I don't necessarily agree with, in that he says this is just not going to be remembered as a great heavyweight era for those reasons. I still think this will. I think when in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, whenever is the right time to judge, I think we will look back on this as one of the greatest eras in history. Nothing is ever going to touch the 1970s when Ali and Frazier were doing their thing. Nothing can touch that. But I think what we have had in this era, and it's not just fights that are in stadiums, it's the little Derek Chisora, Dillian White battles, Derek Chisora, Carlos Takam, and there's so much Dillian White, Joseph Parker. There's so many fights that have been dramatic and exciting in this heavyweight division. So many characters we've seen evolve. Some have flourished, some have crumbled. That I think this particular era will be remembered as a great one. And
you know, my timeline on a Saturday, I do love the interaction on fight night. I do enjoy it. It's a boxing interaction. I do enjoy it, even although you literally get black and white. I mean, you get one end of the spectrum and the other. And those sort of strands were pretty much this. Joshua's always been useless and he's always been chinny. Or as soon as he got clipped, then that was always going to be it. I mean, you always get that stuff, but you can't have the body of work that Joshua has had and say that. Maybe he has always been vulnerable up there. Maybe that is a strand of truth. But he's been one of the best around in this era as well. And he's done that through a fairly fast-tracked amateur and professional career as well. And let's not forget the other side of the spectrum as well with Dubois. You know, Dubois not suddenly become the guy. It's not that long ago. I mean, it looked like Ergovic was going to knock him into next week. I gave Dubois so much credit for coming through that. As I said, Jarrell Miller, who's bang average, he had life and death with Miller and might not have come out on the other side of that. Did he spew it against Usyk? Some say yes. I'm not going to say either way. But there was loads of other stuff that you could have come to the table with Dubois as well. I'm so impressed with where he's got to and how he's become the fighter he has become. But as ever with all of this stuff and these discussions, there are elements of truth in everything. But the truth invariably lies somewhere joining the dots in between all of it, folks. And I think that you know that. Now, the interesting thing now is rematch or not, and is it that Joshua has a rematch with the Saudis and with Riyadh season rather than necessarily with Dubois himself? Either way, I think the bottom line has to be the IBF, doesn't it, Matthew? As you spoke about last week. I don't think the top two in their rankings are rated. I think Joshua was 3 coming into last week, as certainly as my cursory looking of it was back then. But what happens next might actually, as we've seen in the last few weeks, might entirely depend on what the IBF want or say.
Well, we'll see what the IBF do. Yeah, you're right. I don't think they have a mandatory in place at the moment. They do this peculiar thing where they do have two, number one not rated, number two not rated, and then they try and do an eliminator between someone who's down in the other spots at like 3, 4 and 5. The initial word from both camps was that they'd be willing to have a rematch, an immediate rematch. I think from Joshua's point of view, particularly when he was a little bit shell-shocked in his dressing room, he's trying to compute everything that's just occurred to him. He will be, I have to have that rematch. And let's not forget that every time he's lost before, he has demanded an immediate rematch. Did it with Andy Ruiz, did it with Alexander Usyk, worked with Ruiz, didn't really work with Usyk. And there's part of me that looks at that performance and thinks that is a fighter that needs to retire. There's another part of me that thinks he surely can't be that bad again if they were to have a rematch.
And also, Matt, he'll feel he was one punch away. I don't, but I think he or some might feel he was one punch away
You could still
from turning the fight.
You could still make a case for Joshua winning a return. Don't fight the way you fought from the opening bell for a start. Be a bit more defensively cute. Get that jab going. Keep your hands high, and then try and get that right hand over. But I just don't know if, because we've seen nothing but evidence of Joshua second guessing himself ever since he had that war with Vladimir Klitschko. Being bounced off the canvas so many times by Daniel Debois is unlikely to settle his nerves, his mindset. So one wonders if he was to go straight into a rematch with Daniel Debois, goodness knows what his approach will be. Goodness knows what happens when he gets into the ring and he has to make some decisions himself. We've heard it before, haven't we? When he didn't look right during fight week for Ruiz. He didn't look right. What was he doing when he was looking into the air before the opening bell? What's he doing when he's going into the Usyk fight and he's asking people at ringside how he should approach the fight? So you do wonder what this will have done to what some people might say is an already very, very delicate mindset, delicate self-confidence. But I also believe that he has something within him that we have to admire. Not everybody would have got into an immediate rematch with Andy Ruiz after being stopped like that in your US debut. Not everybody would have got into a rematch with Alexander Usyk after losing in the manner that he lost at Tottenham Hotspur Stadium. And it wouldn't surprise me in the slightest if that is now what happens next. And if they are going to do it, I'm sure they can find room on December the 21st to do it. It might be a bit too soon for Joshua, but it wouldn't surprise me to see it appear on that bill. But this whole IBF nonsense, I'm not going to... Yeah, I went on a bit of a rant last week and half regretted it. Well, I was halfway through.
Leave it.
But this chat now, you're already getting this chat of, well, Dubois needs to go for Usyk, doesn't he, for the undisputed fight? We want all 4 belts. I'm just like, my God. Is everyone mental? Just forget that. Forget that. I mean, irrespective of the belt, that was a terrific fight and a terrific performance. Doesn't need a belt for vast majority of sane-minded people to say that Dubois has now put him in position as the 3rd best heavyweight on the planet. And also with Dubois, he's 27 years old.
Yeah.
Usyk and Fury, that might be their last fight. And I think if Usyk gets through Fury again, and I don't doubt it'll be another hard fight for him, is he really going to go looking for Daniel Dubois? Not sure. That's what would surprise me, is if Usyk is then calling out Daniel Dubois. He's already done it. I know there was some controversy, but essentially he won every other exchange in that fight, bar that moment in round 5. And he is not stupid, Alexander Usyk. I'm not saying he's going to be fearful of Dubois, but he must be at a point now in his career where he's a bit like, I think I might be ready to retire. Because beating Dubois again is not going to bring the rewards that beating Fury again is going to. It's not going to bring the accolades. It's not necessarily really going to help his legacy, I don't think. And I'm not sure it'll get his juices going. I think it might be different if Fury wins and then wants to fill his pockets. But I mean, even Fury is now... Fury was talking to IFL the other day. Now he's going down the retirement road again. He's saying, this is going to be my last fight. I want to retire. I want to drink 6, 7, 8 pints every day if I want to. I want that freedom. I like my life now, and that's what I want to do. Whereas Dubois might be in position to take over when those two disappear. Dubois might be in pole position to be the man in the heavyweight division. I mean, who else is going to be around? Joseph Parker? Parker's not young. Zhilei Zhang is... I feel like Zhilei Zhang has been 42 since he came along. So, and is he going to fear Parker? Is he going to fear Zhilei Zhang? But what you will have is something like Dubois fighting Joseph Parker, and Joseph Parker will win a 12-round decision, and we'll be like, what are we getting so excited about? I think that's something like that will happen, if I'm honest, with Daniel Dubois. But, or as speaking to Tris Dixon the other day, he said they might just make Dubois Atoma, Moses Atoma. And then you've got the story of Moses Atoma getting the chance to be the youngest ever heavyweight champion in inverted commas. So there are fights out there. There are storylines still to make. There's always storylines to make. But I do think we'll be in an odd transition phase once this era finishes. And I think this era is getting exceptionally close to the edge. Because I think that might be the last we'll see of Fury and Usyk. Joshua, what's he going to do? He's not going to want to come back and have 2 fights to try and get his confidence back. He'll be looking at Dubois, somehow getting through that and then trying to secure the Fury fight before he goes off into the sunset. But yeah, this era is at the end, and Dubois might be the man to start the new era. But he ain't Mike Tyson, is he? He's not George Foreman.
No, he's not. No, he's not. But he has found confidence in himself and in his own skin. And the other good thing that Dubois does is he throws punches, and he'll keep throwing punches, and he'll throw to head and body. So there is variety as well. I mean, that 3rd round knockdown when AJ missed wildly with the right hand, and as he spun round, Dubois just moved off to his left, and he kind of orchestrated quite a creative little, almost left jab, wasn't it? Little left to hurt AJ. So he's got variety, and he will, if you were to fight Usyk again, that's the thing that can bother Usyk, because he will throw to head and body, and he will keep throwing. But yeah, you suspect that we're visualising the future now, and we're visualising a future in the next 2 years that doesn't include Usyk, that doesn't include Fury, that doesn't include Joshua, but does include one of the last men standing in Daniel Debois. And 4 years ago, who could have ever thought that was the case? Quite remarkable. And 98,128, is that figure right, Matt?
It's a good question, Alex. I'll be careful what I say here. What I will say is that it's sold out very quickly. Now, I was actually trying, and we won't go into Liam Gallagher's performance, but I was actually trying to get Oasis tickets not so long ago. Now, that was definitely sold out. Via the same website that was selling tickets for Joshua and Dubois. So Monday and Tuesday of last week, you could still get tickets in pretty much every part of the stadium. Going on to Ticketmaster, then there was an announcement that it had sold out, and then you couldn't even go in and look anymore. So it looked to me that if it was sold out, there was a late rush on tickets, and for weeks and weeks, when certain people are tweeting that it's a sellout, it wasn't a sellout. You could still get tickets, to the point that Declan Warrington actually had to buy a ticket to get in there and cover it for Boxing Scene. He wrote a really interesting piece about that. Predictably, it has felt the wrath of Frank Warren. So, those days are behind me. I don't need Frankie Boy on the phone. Thank you very much. No, I think Deck was said there was a lot of empty seats. Frank Warren's response to that is, well, there has to be empty seats, otherwise they're not going to be able to see. In certain parts of the stadium, they're not going to be able to see. But I think for me personally, because I was following it with this whole it's sold out, and I was looking at Ticketmaster every day, there were tickets available and lots of them, and then all of a sudden you couldn't even go in. Whereas even now with Oasis tickets, now and again tickets will become available because people are reselling them. It was different. It was almost as if that someone had been given instructions to take all remaining tickets off sale so that they could say it was a sellout. That was my perception of it. But I mean, ultimately, you're kind of going a little bit tit for tat here. You're picking holes in something that probably you don't need to pick holes in, because there was an awful lot of people there. It doesn't matter if there was 90,000, it doesn't matter if there was 98,000. there were an awful lot of people there. But I think the reason that we're getting fed that figure is because that would make it a record-breaking event. Whether that is strictly accurate, I genuinely don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't really matter to me, but don't say it if it's not so. And, as an attempt to burnish some further credibility or embellishment or polish on something that, strictly speaking, doesn't really need it. But that's where we're at in the modern world. Interestingly, 2 points. One, I had a conversation I didn't expect yesterday with someone connected to some people who did have accreditation. I think essentially YouTubers, but had accreditation. They'd actually been out to Saudi covering previous events. They had their accreditation revoked during fight week, and I don't think they were alone from what I heard yesterday. 1 point. That might be a developing strand on the back of Turkey unfollowing people from a week or so ago that you mentioned on the pod. It may not.
It's a concern. I think it's a massive concern. I think the FA are even looking into it as their national stadium, that certain journalists are having their accreditation denied or revoked. I think the line to boxing scene, as I say, I'm not saying anything that's not out there. It's on the boxing scene website, this article. Essentially, it was that there were so many applications and there were just not enough seats. But given how many members of the media that were there, and they're denying certain influential journalists from newspapers, and I'm not going to say that boxing scene is as powerful as the Times or Guardian, but it's the most read boxing website in the world. So who are you allowing in if we're not? So that's a question that I'd ask. So I think it's really concerning that the free press is being denied a place because they've written a few things that they don't deem to be as positive as a lot of the gunk that's out there. I think it's something that we need to keep an eye on, and I think as well, which is also worth noting, it's something they are aware of now, and I think they will probably think carefully about how they approach their next big event and how they're handing out accreditation there. But given that it was their big statement, I think these are some things that were so avoidable. Some of these little storylines that are simmering behind the scenes were all so avoidable, because otherwise you could say it was a triumphant event. It was packed out at the National Stadium. It was headlined by a heavyweight barn burner. But yeah, as for the rest of it, we keep a close eye on it.
Yeah, we do. We monitor that. Yeah, essentially, almost exclusively, it's a good news story, just perhaps with some little salty elements in the mouth. The other thing I wanted to touch on, a pal of mine actually I spoke to yesterday as well, he went with his wife. So I just wanted to discuss the fans' experience just as one of those 90,000+ people that were there on the night. He went with his wife, and they had kind of tickets about kind of midway. He said the viewing was great. So the atmosphere was decent. They got chatting to people from lots of different parts of the world. He said he got the impression that there was quite a few sort of football fans who'd done a double header. They might have gone somewhere else down south during the day and then gone to the boxing in the night. But he said generally they got chatting to a load of lads. He said they were chatting to some Halifax fans, I think, and he said they were in good form. They were good fun. He said lots of nice conversations. But he did say that in his block, he said there's people fighting everywhere. He said there's at least three different fights just in his area of the ground. So that remains a bit of a black eye and a bugbear for the sport, doesn't it? Even in a big event, in a big stadium like that, it's going on.
Yeah, it does, and it's been going on for as long as I've followed boxing, really. I do wonder if it's now getting worse. I'm not suggesting that people go along thinking they're going to have a fight, but I think if you do look at the crowd in certain spots and the age of some of these guys, and how jittery their jaws appear to be, and how wide their pupils appear to be, and some of the rather suspicious queues for cubicles at an awful lot of not just boxing events, at football events, at sporting events. I think there just has to be some kind of tighter security to stop people being in that mindset, because you get thousands of charged up men of a certain age, it rarely ends well. And I think it is a problem in boxing, and it's something that people don't really talk about. I think largely for the organisers, I'm not blaming them, it's probably at the moment unavoidable, but I think it's something that certainly needs to be addressed. Okay,
couple of sentences, but out of Buatsi beating Hutchison in a good fight, Kakachi beating Josh Warrington, Hamza stopping Denny to become European champion, Josh Padley maintaining his unbeaten record, shocking Mark Chamberlain, Josh Kelly overcoming late replacement Ishmael Davis. Out of those, briefly, Matt, who was the big winner in your eyes?
Buatsi was likely the biggest winner, given what was at stake, given his long old journey to get to this point, given that we're still waiting and fearing that he might not fulfil his potential. I thought that Willie Hutchinson was a live underdog in that fight, and I thought Buatsi was really good for the most part. I thought that Josh Kelly kept his head well against a late and dangerous opponent. Full credit to them, to Team Kelly, for accepting that opponent so late in the day. But the most impressive, I just think he's just getting better and better, and that's Hamza Shiraz. I didn't really think that Tyler Denny was gonna win, if I'm honest. I thought it was that from the moment that's announced, even though it's an appealing domestic matchup, I didn't see anybody really picking Tyler Denny to win. But the manner in which Hamza Shiraz is now going about his business tells me, let him loose now on the world scene and see what he can do, because that guy is flying at the moment. He's at his peak. He's got the bit between his teeth. I thought Kakachi was good to get the win. Warrington, I thought it was quite telling the way he left his gloves in the ring, almost as if to say goodbye. His post-fight address was a little bit like, now it might be time to retire. He's been a fantastic servant for British boxing. But as I said earlier on, all of these storylines could have been headlines. All of these fights, and yeah, it's a kind of an afterthought now. But yeah, it was a thoroughly watchable bill from start to finish.
Indeed, it was. I noted an Instagram post yesterday, or maybe it was the day before, from Conor Benn in a photo with Eddie Hearn, Frank Warren, Turki Al-Sheikh and his father, and the strap line was, "You know what's next." ... Well, Conor Benn's fellow drug test positive Alicia Baumgartner's back this week off a 14-month break. There's your link between what's been going on, what hasn't been going on, and what might be going on this weekend, because over the stateside, it's the ladies taking centre stage. Baumgartner against Delphine Persoon, of course, only stopped once. That was a decade and a half ago. It's 5-6 years since she fought Katie Taylor in those two stirring lightweight contests. The near 40-year-old Belgian is up against Baumgartner, who's back. Baumgartner, who, of course, I think, maybe slightly fortunately, controversially beat Michaela Mayer. So did Tasha Jonas. Mayer goes in against Sandy Ryan. That could be fight of the weekend. That'll be on Sky. Friday, Madison Square Garden. Friday's going to be busy because at your call on Channel 5, Thomas Assomba, European champion, takes on Charlie Edwards, whose brother Sonny looks after Assomba and beat Assomba a few years ago as well. So there's plenty going on Friday night. You'll have to get the recorders and computers out. And then on Saturday, DAZN in Sheffield, Rhiannon Dixon is up against Terry Harper. Same Terry Harper who lost, of course, to Sandy Ryan. So a few strands going on at the weekend, Matt.
There's quite a few. Don't really know what the takeout is from all of that. I think the storyline with the Edwards brothers is one that just keeps on giving. Probably just about fancy Charlie Edwards in that, but we still don't really know how much he's got left, but signs are good for Charlie Edwards. I think Mayer and Sandy Ryan is another one that's probably tricky to call. I think might just favour Sandy Ryan in that. I fear that we've seen the best of Terry Harper. I think that could be a Josh Warrington type story for next week. But yeah, there's a bit of action. There's a little bit of action this weekend, but I'm not sure which one I'll be watching.
Yeah, I think Sandy Ryan and Michaela Mayer is the fight of the weekend for me. I think those styles will mesh. Mayer will make the fight. She'll make Ryan fight. Ryan looked better than ever when she stopped Harper. But to be honest, if you're being cruel, you'd say Harper looked half shot, didn't she, that night? If you're being cruel. And maybe the weekend will tell us more about both, really, in that regard. But Ryan Mayer, I think, is the fight of the weekend. Coming up next, it's This Week. And this week in history, we take you back to the 25th of September, 1962, at Chicago's famous Comiskey Park. And it's the first fight between two-time world champion Floyd Patterson, who at the age of 27 was defending his heavyweight title for the third time in his second reign against the up-and-coming, feared number one ranked challenger, Sonny Liston. Matt, as heavyweight crownings go, this is pretty violent and pretty effective. Liston, who had been the, I suppose, the necessary or the unnecessary evil in the heavyweight division, certainly in the eyes of many, certainly in the eyes of Customato, the coach and mentor of Floyd Patterson, certainly in the eyes of John F. Kennedy, the president, who had suggested to Patterson that he doesn't fight Liston, and certainly in the eyes of the crowd, who booed Liston when he was introduced. Rare for that time, isn't it, Matt? With respect and scruples and conventions, Liston booed when he came to the ring on this night.
We always say that boxing is a murky sport. We say that now in 2024. It was an awful lot murkier back then with some of the connections behind the scenes. It was no real secret that Sonny Liston had connections. He had a bit of a, shall we say, colourful past in terms of what he'd been up to and his police record, etc., his criminal record, I should say. And I think it wasn't, I mean, I was looking at, just before this call actually, I was looking at some news reports at the time, but I think some of the journalists were wise to it. They said, look, Customato has been doing this for so long now, this guy has to get his shot. And one writer also said it's ludicrous that Liston is only a 3-2 favourite. But 60% of writers were backing Patterson to win, which when you look at the fight is incredible. It is one of the most destructive coronations in history. It's there with your Tyson Burbick. It's up there with your Dempsey and Jess Willard. But I think it isn't remembered in the same way simply because a long reign didn't follow it. Both Dempsey and Tyson, to a degree, kind of cemented their names in history after that, whereas this is almost as good as it got for Sonny Liston as the world heavyweight champion. Okay, we know that he went and fought Patterson in the rematch before he fought Muhammad Ali, but this is a time before Muhammad Ali. This is a time where people are concerned about the future of the sport, and this was not a welcomed fight by certain people involved. Patterson, however, had managed to get a good deal on the contract. 55% of ancillary rights, 45% of the net gate. I think Liston was down to receive something like 12.5% of the net gate. But he was just so eager for his chance. For many at the time, and go back and look at boxing publications at the time, Liston was regarded as the uncrowned champion. Given what he was doing and who he was beating in the background, it was widely thought at the time that Liston was beating a better quality of opposition than Patterson was. And get this for someone as well. Patterson had been dropped 12 times in all of his world heavyweight title fights. Now, we know he'd had the up and downers with Ingemar Johansson. But his body language, we spoke about body language earlier on with Joshua and Dubois. If you look at Patterson's body language before the opening bell, he's got his back to Liston. Liston is prowling and ready, barely moving, just waiting for the opening bell. Patterson is just skipping, dancing up and down on the spot, head down, head down. Just the nervous energy within him was obvious. But the manner in which Liston just took him apart, I mean, yeah. The funny thing as well is that most people think that Liston was past his best at this point. But it's a devastating finish. But you could argue that Patterson got it all wrong as well. But that moment where he got trapped, fight was over. Trapped on the ropes and ferocious shots to finish.
Left hooks, Matt, isn't there? 3 off them. There's an initial left hook, and that freezes Patterson against the ropes with his body slightly turned to one side. And then he kind of scuffs or thuds another left hook off him. And the final left hook, he misses with a right. And then the final left hook, it's shades of Foreman against Joe Fraser, isn't it? When he almost lifts him off the canvas. One of his feet comes off the canvas with the ferocity and the power of that final left hook, Matt.
Yeah, I mean, the Sports Illustrated report is good. It says Liston is not a notably swift and flashy hitter, but the final left hook crashed into Patterson's cheek like a diesel rig going downhill, no brakes. There are precious few mammals of any variety that could have beaten the count. The only miracle is that Patterson managed to get back to his knees. Yeah, and he did that with Everlast gloves that he was made to wear. This is in the newspaper preview, the day before or the day of the fight, that Liston had been grumbling that he was made to wear Everlast gloves that he felt were a lot thicker and heavier than those that Patterson was wearing. He had taken his own gloves, Sonny Liston, and he wasn't allowed to wear them because the officials were concerned that if Liston got his choice of glove, that Patterson might get cut. It's too much of a risk. So Liston actually had to wear much heavier gloves than was standard at the time, and yet he still just walked through Floyd Patterson.
He did indeed. All of it over in just a couple of minutes. And he'd do the same. I watched the second fight, which was in 1963. Again, that was in a round and even more destructive right from the start. He just goes after him, and Liston does it again to defend his title. Now, perhaps no surprise, 13-inch reach advantage, Matt, and nearly 2 stones heavier as well at 213 pounds. Patterson weighing in at 189 on this night. To say that all the advantages weighed heavily towards the betting favourite Liston were an understatement. Managed by Blinky Palermo as well. Those ties to the mob and to the mafia were distinct for Sonny Liston, hence the reason he'd been denied his opportunity so often. $100, Matt, for a ringside seat on this night, the richest night at that point in boxing history. Put a few quid in the pocket of Floyd Patterson. And how would you figure this? As violent heavyweight coronations go, how does this one figure?
Yeah, well, I think I said, didn't I? I think the two that always spring to mind, the two that I always think are the most violent, it's Dempsey Willard and Tyson Berbick. And then you've got this one. But you didn't then have the rain afterwards. Which, I mean, Liston now, today, makes it into most top 10 of all time. And I still believe an awful lot of that is down to how good he could have been rather than him proving himself at the very top. Now, he was beating fighters like Eddie Machen, Cleveland Williams, Zora Foley, all long before the likes of Muhammad Ali was doing the same, and he was beating these guys when they were pretty much at their best. And it does tell you really that Patterson did lead quite a sheltered life as the champion, that all of these fighters could not get a shot at him. Some might say it was clever management by D'Amato. Some might say it was unfair. But I do think that if Liston had been allowed to challenge for the title, say 1957, 58, he'd have reigned right through, and he'd have had a fearsome, formidable reign. But he was kept away from it.
He would defend his title against Patterson a year later, and then he'd bump into Muhammad Ali not once but twice in 64 and 65. A short reign and a short trip to the top on this night to become champion for Sonny Liston back in 1962. Go back and watch both of those at your viewing pleasure, and we'll do more of the same again next week. Thanks to you lovely Patreons who've been supporting us as well. Lots of you interacting on the Patreon app, getting in touch with us regarding the new Best Of series. There'll be plenty more of that coming your way in the coming weeks as well. We really appreciate it. Still time to sign up. Less than a fiver, less than £5 for a whole month. All in aid of the cause, and I've not taken a penny out yet, so I can't even say that it's been helping me go to Ibiza, fueling my nights out, because the truth is it's not. Yeah, but we do appreciate it, and we'll speak to you again soon. Take care, folks.